This week we look at Millennium Development Goal number 2, which has to do with achieving universal primary education. The main target related to this goal is ensuring that by the year 2015, children everywhere, both boys and girls, will be able to complete primary school. Now we're going to look at that from a couple different perspectives this week. But first, as we've done in the pattern you're going to see throughout this course, there are really 3 sections that we're going to be looking at every week. The first relates to the report on investing in development. The second then is the background for the goal that we're talking about, this week, Goal 2. And third is then specifically how that goal is being implemented or relates to Eastern Europe. So let's talk a little bit first about the report Investing in Development. I think that that's a vital part of this class, and I hope you're enjoying that report as we go through it. One of the things I like about it is that one of the biggest problems over here, and everybody that you talk to will say the same thing, using the Russian word usually, which is mentalitet. It's the mentality of the people. There are so many times that even the simplest thing that you suggest, people say, oh no, that's impossible. This idea that anything that they haven't been able to do yet is impossible to do is something that needs to be eliminated. And one of the things I like about the readings for Investing in Development this week is that what they're arguing is that the Millennium Development Goals shouldn't, as too many people feel, be considered some pie-in-the-sky ideas, but rather as practical policy objectives that, with proper planning and proper investment, can be reached by 2015. So the first chapter we read, on chapter 4, specifically talks about that, how to focus on policies. Chapter 5 then starts to talk about public investment. And that part of the trick to this, and he goes through specific tools that should be used, part of the trick is starting at the end where you want to be and then working backward. This is a typical evaluation tool now, where you do a logic model and you start where these are the outputs that you want, and then you move forward and figure out what inputs, what processes, what resources you need to reach those outputs. So that's what this first thing in Investing in Development is about. And that theme of outputs we're going to see a little bit too when we look at the background of Goal 2. According to the World Health Organization, there's 115 million school-aged children that are not in school. 56% of them are girls, 94% of them are in developing countries. They also, the World Health Organization, has very specific reasons that they tie education to health. And as always, we're going to look at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs statistics. They give a good background on it. But the one that I really want to talk about is a really important report that I want you to read. The thing is, when you first download it, I don't want you to get scared because it looks like it's 157 pages, I think is how it shows up at the bottom of the PDF. But it's not. Most of that are appendices, which are interesting, and you might want to look at and read. A lot of them are charts and things that are interesting. And then there's an extensive bibliography, which is good, but long. So we're really only talking about this report being about 50 pages. And the title of the report, it was a World Bank-funded evaluation called From Schooling Access to Learning Outcomes, an Unfinished Agenda, with the subtitle of An Evaluation of World Bank Support to Primary Education. Interesting thing about this is that this report sort of argues against the basic premise of the Millennium Development Goal. Because the Millennium Development Goal is really talking about, okay, every kid should sit through primary school. What this report is talking about, back to our theme here of outputs, what the report's talking about is just sitting through school isn't good enough. We need to be measuring what they've gotten on the other end. What is their level of literacy? Is their literacy level adequate for their society and to fit into other societies as they develop? What about numbers? Their ability to add, subtract, do what they need to do to survive in the world as it's changing. So this report takes on or expands the Millennial Development Goal by trying to say where you're really trying to get. When you say you want everybody to sit in school, what you're really saying is, this is where you want to get. And this is really interesting. I think it's very significant and something to think about. And this is especially true since most of us involved in this class are teachers, and we certainly know that at whatever age we happen to teach, from preschool through graduate school, that it's certainly possible for students to sit through a class and not get as much out of it as we think they should, and they're graded accordingly. When you're talking about developing countries, it's not just about grades, it's about how their entire society is going to move forward. And certainly that's true in developed countries. You don't want to move backward because you're not learning the things that you need to learn. But that's a really good resource, and I really hope you take the time to read it, and certainly some of our discussion questions will focus on that. And then lastly, as we've been doing, we're going to look at goal number 2 in Eastern Europe. We're going to look once again at the Millennium Development Goals Report 2000, and then the Progress and Prospects in Europe and Central Asia. Those are 2 documents we're going to be looking at each time, and I think we've talked about them, and you should be a little familiar with them from last week. We're also going to look at Goal 2 in Moldova's National Report on the MDG, which we looked at Goal 1 last week. And Moldova's position is essentially, and their concern is, and should be, that since the fall of the Soviet Union, they're actually going backward on this goal. Because of the culture and the way the Soviets worked, just about everybody went to school because they really had to go to school. And now, some of the poorest, for instance, in the farms, since they're not getting checks anymore, the kids have to work to help with the farms. The Roma, we tend to call gypsies, but the Roma ethnic group during the Soviet Union were treated like everybody else, at least in the government level, but now they're an ethnic group that doesn't really fit into society the way the other groups do. So that's a problem, and those are mostly the kids that are missing education, which just means it's going to be harder for that cycle of poverty to resolve. But the interesting thing is, and this goes back to our outcomes, whereas in Moldova they sort of agree they need to work on achieving universal primary education again, but I also put in here a report from the Republic of Georgia in Eastern Europe talking about how they feel that they've pretty much achieved universal primary education, which I'm not sure the numbers really bear that out, but that's their mindset on this. And so what they're trying to do is look at outputs and improve quality. So I want you to look at Georgia's report because it talks about what they're doing with teachers, what they're doing with funding. They're working on the output end already, feeling that that's more important to them than just getting these few percent of children that clearly aren't going to school still in. And so that's just a different perspective. So really, from the beginning, this whole week, I want you to be thinking about those 2 streams that we got going. We've got having access to a school, having access to teachers, having access to books, which is really what the United Nations is looking at. But then you have the World Bank evaluation saying, okay, that should be a bottom line, but then once we put students in those circumstances, what are the outputs? What do we expect them to be able to do? So this should be an interesting week for those of us who are involved in the education field. And I think that these are good resources, and I think you'll enjoy them. And when you go to the forums, you'll have a chance to discuss them as well. One last thing, the picture you've been looking at, primary school in Rachia, here in Moldova. I had the opportunity to go visit. I think you can see on the bottom there it was built in 1983, and it's in complete and total disrepair. There's been virtually no infrastructure improvements, pretty much generally in this town that I was in northern Moldova, since the Soviet Union collapsed. And so it gives you an idea why Moldova and some of the other former Soviet republics, the CIS countries, are concerned about losing ground over the last 20 years. But I just thought this school was sort of a good illustration of the importance of continued funding and continued concern. Just because something exists now doesn't mean it's going to exist forever, and we all need to be vigilant.